Hello. Welcome. I'm Susie. This is my podcast. I feel like we are living in a cynical age. The last half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st have been characterized by growing distrust of institutions, widening gaps in wealth, and wild swings of social attention from one incident to another, more as a distraction from the monotonies of daily life than taking notice how communities are affected by those things. If we think of America as a person who was born at our founding, we could estimate our growth as being in sort of a young adult phase, a place where the innocence of our youth is tempered and eroded by the practical realities of our surroundings. We've become wary and suspicious and a little angry. But regardless of how guarded you may be, or how critical you may be of the constant bombardment of messages flying into your stimulus holes, you too are susceptible to being influenced by a carefully crafted message. Our minds are infinitely complex and still quite mysterious. The theme I keep coming back to is how we shape ourselves through stories. The stories of our ancestors, of our families and communities, and those stories culminate in identity. In the modern age, we're awash in influence messaging. From news media to social media, we're receiving points of view from every which way. I want to break that idea apart a little bit and talk about the general indifference to propaganda and how it allows itself to find its way into our social consciousness and how it may present a threat to democratic principles. What is propaganda and how did it come to be? On its own, propaganda is a value-neutral messaging tactic. Its basic definition is the use of a simple message using some form of mass media to persuade the viewer to a particular point of view or opinion. To be quite cliché, the Oxford Dictionary definition reads as follows. Quote, information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view, end quote. I find it interesting that Oxford defines propaganda as typified by bias or misinformation. Further, that the dictionary definition specifically points to political propaganda is an important qualifier here. I think this tells us something about the cumulative effect of political propaganda in modern history that can't be ignored, namely, that it's mostly been used as a tool for very, very bad things. But stripped away of any specific historical context, we see propaganda most often as a tool for the acquisition of or the perpetuation of power. And through that critical lens, it perhaps becomes a little easier to discern something sensible or at least comprehensible from the cacophony of points of view we are immersed in at all times. Propaganda has had a role in human culture since the earliest documented civilizations. Importantly, the ancients really didn't have a mass media mechanism through writing because the populace were predominantly illiterate. Subsequently, ancient propaganda takes the form of oral traditions like stories, songs, and poems, state expressions of power like statues, carvings, oratory, and plays, and expressions of dynastic or imperialistic power like buildings, tombs, and monuments. The Egyptians are probably one of the first and the most famous examples, with pyramids, tombs, and temples that have mystified and inspired archaeologists and historians for centuries. The Romans, as well, were enormously successful with their propagandistic statecraft. Aqueducts, state buildings, sewer systems, temples, and public spaces were the heart of Roman building projects, but as important were major public works for venues of entertainment. The Romans excelled at engaging the citizenry. They spread literacy throughout their empire, not just in Latin, but they would make state proclamations and public information in the local languages as well. The Romans were practical, and they would conquer a region mostly by immersion after their initial martial conquests. If you existed in the Roman Empire, you were granted Roman citizenship, and citizens, most especially in Rome itself, were imbued with a sense of nationalism and the heart of their culture was military in nature. Violence was seated in their origins, even in the story of the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, who were brothers abandoned as infants and raised by a wolf mother. In the end, Romulus murdered his brother Remus in a struggle for conquest for the heart of what would become Rome, and thus the heart of the Roman Empire. I think Emperor Vespasian's contribution, the Colosseum in 80 CE, symbolizes the propaganda skills of the Roman emperors best. Vespasian ascended to the seat of the emperor at the death of the Emperor Nero, though not as simple as the stories would have it, with Nero fiddling while Rome burned. It went very bad. Vespasian had a full uphill battle in regaining the faith and the trust of the people and quelling the unrest that was exploding in the streets. So he gave the Romans what they wanted: orchestrated and controlled death, mock naval battles, wild animals mauling people, and most famously, gladiatorial bouts. And they loved it. The Colosseum remains probably the most recognizable and iconic symbol of ancient Rome. The monumental expression of state power has a pretty specific purpose. That is to say, to maintain control through demonstrations of wealth and mastery of engineering marvels that, from the perspective of a plebe, looks like almost godlike power. Maintaining power is critical. If you just do the math, you understand that no one individual or even a small group of people can maintain control over a mass of people without their consent. And that consent is willfully and happily given, usually. For the citizenry, particularly among the ancients whose world was constantly threatening and insecure, it's a natural response mechanism to acquiesce to state power. It's a means of seeking safety, protection, and acceptance. And these qualities are vital for humans to flourish. This idea is described in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which categorizes and prioritizes the basic needs humans must satisfy to exceed beyond basic survival. Those categories are physiological, safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Now, this is happening largely on an unconscious level. So even without a deep understanding of anthropological processes, it seems very intuitive to conclude that people feel greater security in greater numbers and where those numbers reflect themselves. If this state of being is threatened, the human psyche will seek out conditions that restore those feelings of basic satisfaction of needs. In the medieval period, things got really complicated. First, there's been an impressive population growth made possible by a warming trend throughout Europe. Also, technology has continued, as it do, especially the printing press, which had incalculable efforts on human society since its invention in 1436. In 1532, Henry VIII, King of England, who was a Renaissance man in all the senses of the word, harnessed all of his considerable theological skills to publish a book titled A Glass of Truth, both with an extra E for ye ancient authenticity. And in it, he makes the case that it was the right and moral thing to do to set aside his wife and the queen, Catherine of Aragon, because she was his brother's wife. You see, Catherine and Henry's older brother Arthur were betrothed at the age of 4 and were married at 15. Their marriage lasted 5 months, during which time Arthur was sickly and finally died of what they called sweating sickness at the time. Henry then became heir, and when he took the throne, it made sense to maintain the political alliance that Catherine represented and to avoid paying back to Spain her enormous dowry by marrying her to Henry. She swore that her marriage to Arthur was unconsummated, and given the circumstances, her story was credible. They were children, and Arthur was probably not super equipped, given his weak constitution and his illnesses. The Pope proffered a dispensation, allowing Henry to marry his brother's widow, and they were happily married for over 20 years. She had only one surviving child from Henry, a daughter, Mary, and that was the kernel of all the problems. Succession to a woman was not widely considered valid in anywhere, let alone medieval England, and it inspired Henry to find ways to get a wife who could beget him a son. But his desire to divorce Catherine to marry one of her maids, Anne Boleyn, was unprecedented and highly problematic, not least because the English people loved Catherine and they saw no reason to set her aside. And moreover, because it was forbidden by the doctrines of Roman Catholicism, which was the state religion, the people would not understand nor support a king in conflict with Rome. Henry couldn't have killed Catherine because her political importance as a daughter of the Spanish royal family and cousin to the Holy Roman Emperor, and she was determined to stay in her rightful place as queen. Catherine was both deeply pious and politically brilliant, and she held the firm conviction that she could not be yanked out of her position. And this presented a real pickle for the king. So, Henry put pen to page and wrote a treatise of more than 80 pages and publicized it amongst the nobility who would influence their people and spread the word. Moreover, Henry elevates his personal mission to remarry as a theological contest with the Pope. He presents Catholicism as an offense against the monarchy, which was, in Henry's view, a direct link to God. The king could not have a dual loyalty to a human pope and to God. The Pope was an unnecessary middleman that infringed upon the natural and divine right of the king. Plus, the publication of the Bible in English and the Protestant Reformation sweeping across Europe gave Henry a very convenient lever to pull with his people. They could access God, just like the king, by reading the Bible themselves without the intermediary of corrupt clergy. Catholicism was banned from Britain, and Protestantism was carefully crafted with Henry's very own formulation of ritual tradition and liberal thought, and he enforced this through brutal tyrannical punishment like hangings, drawing and quartering, and burnings. And people got the point. The medieval playbook that Henry VIII helped to write was referenced throughout European history, most especially as a way of supporting conflicts between sovereign powers. Skillful messaging that made the struggle seem to be connected to an individual's existence or survival is a powerful way of motivating people. In modern times, there are too many examples of effectively deployed propaganda campaigns to count. The growth of mass media like radio and cinema gave an entirely new way to access people's most basic instincts through harnessing powerful emotional responses. The Nazis were super good at it, but I feel like we've talked enough about those idiots for the time being, don't you? So let's look at some regular Americans, shall we? Propaganda was huge throughout the American Revolution. I think the most excellent example of this is Thomas Paine in Common Sense. But in the U.S., when World War I broke out in 1914, we were dead set against getting involved in it. The wars in Europe were constant and only represented the struggles of old, broken imperialist regimes clutching on to old ways and scrambling for land. But America looks forward, and there was nothing in it for us. Woodrow Wilson won his way to the presidency in 1916 on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the war went on and on and on, and it seemed like it would never end. And Wilson saw an opportunity to be the peacemaker of the world and to immortalize the U.S. as a global peacekeeper. In 1917, Wilson created the Creel Committee, or by its actual name, the Committee for Public Information. And its mission was to help persuade the American people to go to war. The committee spewed forth an infinite stream of messaging in the form of posters, paintings, pageants, radio plays, speeches, and on and on. The nature of the messaging was pretty classic propaganda that used simple concepts and images and connected them to a simple ideal and then pointed them at a basic emotion like fear or anxiety. There's a really famous poster featuring an ape-like creature drooling furiously and looming over a woman clutched in its massive paw. He's wearing like a little helmet of the German army with the pointy spike on top. It's called a Pickelhaube, and it says something like, "Defeat the Hun." And so with very few words, an image is created of a German person who is brutish and violent, less than human, and dead set on spreading savagery wherever it goes. The US pretty quickly took on an anti-German sentiment, banning or boycotting German products, discriminating against German immigrants, and inspiring lots of young boys to sign up for the army and go kick the Kaiser's booty. And it was very, very effective. And the American public was easily and quickly persuaded to point rage at an archetype. At least they could blame their problems on a villain, which also suggests that a victory then brings a glorious improvement to their lives. One of the men who made this grand project work was a fellow named Edward Bernays. Bernays is widely acknowledged as the father of public relations. He wrote many books and instructive manuals in which he discussed the idea of engineering consent. He innovated processes that used tools of mass media to bypass reason and appeal to emotional hot buttons in the American public. He was a clever bastard. He understood that the psychology of the individual was overtaken by the psychology of the group. His work has shaped American consciousness for the last century and a half, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means next. How does propaganda work, and what is its effect? As discussed already, as a rule, propaganda is a pretty straightforward appeal to emotional responses connected to feelings of fear and anxiety. But how does that work, and why? Humans are a very sophisticated species with enormous capacity for intellectual discernment. So why is it that we are so easily persuaded by carefully crafted messaging? I think the first and simplest explanation is that we are creatures of our emotions. Human beings are primarily driven by our emotions. Every act and every choice a person makes is made in response to an emotional state, even if it follows a rational path. It's how our biology engineered itself. We are compelled to seek the things that will ensure our basic needs. Similarly, we are compelled to refute or avoid the things that we perceive as a threat to those needs. Boiled down to its simplest essence, I think that's the core of our social consciousness. Another enormously important part of the explanation is connected to education. By definition, education tends to be something of a foil to propaganda. Where propaganda establishes what to think, education establishes how to think. Education is a tricky area, though. Until the 20th century, education was largely private, religious education. It was reserved for those with means because it wasn't free. I think it's fairly obvious that a public that largely lacks any ability to understand contextual data that would help them come to an informed decision will be easily swayed by messaging that bypasses rational thinking and directly accesses emotional responses. For one thing, that's an audience that's likely to feel some type of way if you come at them with a bunch of facts and information and suggest that they're dumb for not knowing it and should trust you as the teacher. People will respond to that, but their response for most Americans is likely to be a sort of chafing. So in American culture, propaganda must take a more insidious form. It adopts the form that allows the audience to assume they came to a conclusion on their own, and this messaging merely echoes what they've known to be intuitively true all along. And this process is allowed to occur where epistemic formation, that is, the way a person cultivates their understanding of the world, is interrupted from observable or empirical knowledge to absorption of doctrinal knowledge. In other words, you believe what you're told rather than what you see. So much so that you will fill in the blanks with reasonable explanations for apparent contradictions. This is a process that relies on trust. So why is education problematic in this context? It seems like it should be the solution to the problem. And that's true, except that education relies upon the free exchange of ideas. And if that condition is mitigated, then you begin to wander in the terrain of dogma and possibly propaganda. In the US, public education is now the norm. Hooray! However, that also means that it's a mechanism by which the state or prevailing cultural norms can shape people's understanding of the world. For example, in the United States, the Daughters of the Confederacy got their hands on history textbooks in the South, and rewrote them to whitewash the whole slavery thing. And somehow those books made their way into every state's education system, and it became the totally normal and accepted method to teach children that slavery wasn't that bad and that the slaves were actually pretty happy. Like, whoa. Also, lol, they didn't just happen to find their way into public schools. There was like an active and well-funded campaign to distribute and like promote and intimidate to make that happen. When I think about it now, it seems loco bananas. But even when I was a kid, if you suggested that white supremacy or racism was advocated in state expressions of power, like laws or public education, as a result of slavery, you would be shouted down as a communist. Like, that was a radical point of view, no matter how obvious it is to anyone who understands what slavery actually was. It seemed intuitive to me as a child. And then I was like continuously told, like, no, terrorist. That's, get it straight. It's very confusing. That blasé position of dismissing critique of long-held traditions is why progress is so hard. The group social consciousness will resist any admission of harm for probably pretty obvious reasons. It invokes a very powerful emotional response of guilt and shame. And like, who wants that? Nobody. So what is the process by which a person will act in a manner contrary to their own self-interest through the manifestation of firmly held convictions? Dr. Jason Stanley, a professor of philosophy at Yale and all-around very smart person, wrote a book called How Propaganda Works. And in it, he discusses the idea of flawed ideology. And very, very basically, the concept addresses the acceptance of a conclusion as sound, though it's based on, demonstrably flawed premises. And according to basic logic, a conclusion can be deduced from a combination of base reasons, and that forms an argument. It relies upon those bases or premises as being true and logically sound. Flawed ideology essentially allows firm belief in the soundness of the conclusion, though it's made from a combination of one or more flawed premises, like a house built on a bad foundation. Thus, according to Dr. Stanley, political propaganda succeeds in hijacking rational processes by interrupting epistemic formation. Again, the formation of your belief being interrupted by a message, though it conflicts with your observable, understanding of what's happening around you. Through leveraging known or expected emotional responses and a careful deployment of logically structured, though intellectually flawed ideas, one can point one's audience towards a specific conclusion, and they then feel they got there on their own. This leads to Dr. Benet's state of manufactured or engineered consent. If you're the political sort, you've probably heard Steve Bannon, a wildly problematic satyr and very gross man, talking about flooding the zone with shit. His idea is if you throw out enough noise that has even a suggestion of plausibility when situated in a flawed logical context, you can pretty easily overwhelm people to a position of responding through vibes. In other words, too long, didn't read, but it stinks and I don't like it. It's a very cynical method that assumes people will simply give up and accept whatever truth feels right to them rather than thinking through a decision if given half a chance. It's also really predatory, in my view. It suggests that the proponent of propaganda doesn't believe in the truth of their own argument, so it's necessary to resort to theatrics and appeal to strong emotional responses. Like, intellectually, that's all horrible, but it has real-world practical effects that are much more urgent. Propaganda also takes shape in the programmatic harnessing of epistemological vulnerability to galvanize power. And this can take a lot of different forms. For instance, the aforementioned Mr. Gross Bannon encouraged alt-right extremists to start infiltrating school boards. And more insidiously, things like legislative templates, where there are laws written by partisan activists or advocacy groups that are disseminated to state legislatures to be enacted in those states. And they're usually really well-funded efforts to support restrictive legislation with very little resistance from the public because most people simply don't, pay attention to what's happening in their state capitals. And these groups depend on that, and they weaponize it to create laws based on flawed ideology. That is a direct threat to the effective working of a democratic system. How is propaganda working in American culture right now? Propaganda has pride of place in American society at this moment in time. I've talked a lot about the news media in previous episodes, and one of the more important things to understand about modern media is that it's as much a conveyance of propaganda as it is of information. And here I use information as like a verifiable data point that contributes to a greater understanding of the world. I won't call it truth because I just think that word is laden. The act of discernment becomes a laborious task in an environment such as this. With a zone flooded in shit, it's harder to see what's a legit danger or what's just an effort to evoke an emotion. And if the emotion evoked is powerful enough, it may completely override the effort to support a conclusion with a sound argument. I think we're seeing a lot of this in American politics right now. Really, anything involving the former president is a contest with reality. What's really interesting to me about this whole thing is that the statistics aren't any different than at any point in American history. And what I mean by that is that political extremism or fringe groups have been omnipresent and typically represent about 30% population grouping, like in the US and like everywhere. It's just like kind of a known quality that there's always going to be like a pocket of, like contrarianism or something. And that's similar to the reported support for the former president. Like it aligns with like a fringe extremist movement. And yet that political minority has become the dominant force in American politics. On its face, it makes very little sense. But when you dig a little deeper into why that support group exists in the way that it does, and the uses of propaganda to legitimize a fringe element as the natural leader of an entire political party, like you begin to see that a deliberate and painstakingly crafted process of manufactured consent has been performed. Let's walk through some examples that illustrate this point. Hunter Biden. Oh, geez Louise. There's like almost too much to cover here, so I don't intend to be exhaustive, but here's the basic facts. Hunter Biden is the second son of the current president, Joe Biden. Hunter has a history of substance abuse, and his life is unfolded in many ways that are resultant of this problem, including, it seems, some tax evasion and a gun violation that he pled guilty to in June of 2023. However, beyond any actual laws he may have broken, Hunter has become a powerful avatar for a group of ideas that encapsulate the hardcore right wing of the Republican Party's position that establishment political leaders, specifically Democrats, are corrupt and authoritative. They allude to Hunter's substance abuse because it invokes ideas of criminality and therefore supports ideas of corruption through nepotistic means. Much of this is done as a false equivalency against the many crimes committed by the former president. CRT, or critical race theory. This has been covered a lot, so again, I won't be exhaustive. I mean, obviously, LOL. But in short, critical race theory is a range of ideas, papers, articles, and debates that discuss if and how racial mechanics are featured in legal frameworks. What is the impact of that? What are the possible pathways to address that, etc.? It's legal scholarship. That's really important work, but it's not an educational credo of any kind. Yet that's how it's marketed by the right, as a threat to children everywhere. Indoctrination by the left to teach children to hate white people. You can see from the severity of that reaction and the disproportionality of the conclusion when faced with the actual thing that it's a very direct reaction to propaganda. The idea of CRT as misrepresented with enough misinformation to make people feel like they're actually being targeted when it's sort of a, it's sort of a term of legal art to describe a specific, school of thought that's emerging in legal circles, not kindergartens. drag, as in drag queens. Again, we have an avatar situation. LGBTQ plus communities have won serious victories in anti-discrimination legislation, same-sex marriage equality, and a huge movement of the cultural acceptance meter through better representation overall. The trans and drag communities that represent probably the smallest portion of the LGBTQ plus diaspora are a convenient target, since the targets on homosexual and bisexual cisgender individuals has become very much smaller. So ludicrous laws that drag shows and still with the bathrooms, like what? And like, what is the actual fucking obsession with sports? Like, God, it's so confusing to me. Like, why is that such a flashpoint? Like for like discussing a person's right to be? I don't understand. Anyway, AIDS. The progress made by LGBTQ plus people was set back by decades with the AIDS crisis. The president at the time, Ronald Reagan, was utterly dismissive of the disease as it ravaged homosexual communities for years in the 1980s. He characterized it as a gay disease, and his deep connection to the evangelical right meant that there was no way he was going to lift a finger to help gay people with their gay cancer. Asshole. And he was more than happy to be the poster child for the propagandistic efforts to suppress any effort to support research to find a cure. Asshole. Social services, aka welfare. Again, Reagan characterized people who relied on social services as a result of their economic marginalization as criminals and freeloaders. The welfare queen, that wildly mythologized, freeloader on the kindness of the American people. The damage of that is still being felt as we're still fighting misapprehensions that state assistance is somehow a bad thing. It's bad to help people who need help. They should help themselves. Bootstrap, you lazy bastards. January 6th. Obviously, this is the most important example to me. The propaganda that has emerged in the wake of the insurrection on January 6th is actively obscuring citizens' ability to access real information that affects their lives. Congress held a series of just stunning hearings explaining exactly what happened, yet huge portions of Americans are still like, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? Seriously? An insurrection at the federal capital, like of the whole government of the country. Like what? How do you mean? What do you mean? What's the big deal? That's a result of propaganda. For example, Fox News, the largest and most powerful purveyor of political propaganda, did not air many of those hearings. And what they did air was heavily edited and added conflicting commentary to obfuscate the naked facts. This was not helped by the fact that Congress is probably the least trusted it's ever been in the history of the institution. Like, as an example, the only two Republicans that served on the January 6th committee, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, left Congress as a result of this. They were so reviled for their participation. It's stunning. The former president, after 2 criminal indictments, continues to aggressively campaign using propaganda tools. Here's a really recent example. At a recent campaign rally, Trump complained about the second indictment, which he characterized as a political act of persecution. And then he vowed revenge. And the way he will achieve this revenge is by committing an act of political persecution against Joe Biden once he's reelected president. Like, without even a hint of irony. This is the power of propaganda. In the year 536 CE, there was a global cataclysm. Data suggests that the volcano Krakatoa erupted and shot 30 miles of dust and smoke and ash into the atmosphere. The cloud covered half the globe and caused a small period of severe cooling. Civilizations died, and history was wiped out for a millennium. I think about this event when my anxiety about the state of the world gets really intense. Anxiety and fear about the future is a universal human quality. What could happen? What will happen? And how? Those moments are the moments when I'm reminded just how small and unimportant I really am. And it really helps me to relax. It may not be very helpful for you, but hey, you never know. The reason I bring this up is because the end of the world is a real possibility. Like solar flares, nuclear devastation, global warming, on and on. But if it comes, it's likely to come in the form of a Krakatoa or an asteroid. It's less likely that the end of the world will occur as a result of a change in society. The great thing about an inclusive society is that there's room for everyone. Okay, so what is the whole point of this, Susie? Why are you going on and on about something that everyone already knows about propaganda? I'm so glad you asked. I'm really eager to tell you. As much as the smartest among us may maintain a very conscious awareness of the presence of propaganda and public relations messaging in our lives, we are existing in a culture where the second criminal indictment of a presidential candidate has increased his favorability in polling amongst a significant block of voters. This appears to me to be a very clear and distinct example of the success of propaganda in facilitating a minority rule state within a democratic government. And as I discussed in the series of episodes on cults, the epistemic processes that occur are real and powerful enough to manifest into very destructive outcomes. Propaganda can serve as a signpost for a zeitgeist, and we fail to pay attention to it at our peril. And similar to other points of awareness, it does us no good to lash out at people who may not yet have reached the same point of awareness. It requires a measure of understanding and a healthy dose of empathy to see someone who may be deeply influenced by propaganda as a person capable of seeing reason. Reason and emotion are often not compatible. But when the formation of reasoning in a person's understanding of the world is shaped by their emotional responses, that is to say, they are led to a conclusion via the accessing of certain predictive emotional responses, then they may not be conscious that their conclusions may be based on flawed logic or inaccurate information. To them, it's the truth. So something to keep in mind as we poo-poo the effect of propaganda in our world, because we're also wizened and cynical. Don't forget, you too are influenced by messaging. Thank you for listening.